This is the first of what will be 3 videos dealing with bat mitzvah. However, the subject of bat mitzvah will actually only be a springboard for dealing with a larger issue of the status of women in Judaism and Jewish law. This is actually the subject of these 3 videos, the status of women in Judaism and Jewish law. So I want to begin by explaining why I'm using the subject of bat mitzvah as a kind of springboard to deal with a larger issue of the status of women in Judaism. So bat and bar mitzvah mark the transition in traditional Judaism from childhood to adulthood in terms of Jewish law. Bat mitzvah literally means daughter of mitzvah, commandment, or subject to commandment, subject to the commandments of the Jewish tradition, the commandments, mitzvot, that are the basis of the Jewish law. So at the age of 12, the Jewish female is becoming subject to Jewish law, marking the transition from childhood to adulthood from a legal point of view. For a Jewish male at the age of 13, the male becomes bar mitzvah, son of mitzvah, subject to the mitzvot, the commandments that are the basis of the Jewish law. And so at the age of 13, the male, this marks the transition, bar mitzvah, from childhood to adulthood, when the male is now regarded as an adult subject to Jewish law. So in a previous video, I gave a class on bar mitzvah, and in that class, I delineated several things that were done in traditional Judaism in terms of ritual practice to mark the bar mitzvah of the Jewish male, to celebrate the bar mitzvah of the Jewish male. And as far as I'm aware, none of these things were done in traditional Judaism. If so, it would be an exception. But as far as I'm aware in traditional Judaism, none of these things in terms of ritual practice were done to celebrate bat mitzvah. And it's in light of that fact, then, that in traditional Judaism, bat mitzvah simply wasn't celebrated as far as I'm aware. It's in light of that fact that I then want to deal with the larger issue of the status of women in Judaism and Jewish law. But before I begin with that larger issue, let me just go back to that, to the earlier video that I did regarding bar mitzvah, and I'll briefly go back over the things that were done to mark the bar mitzvah of a Jewish male, and which, as far as I'm aware, were never done to mark the bat mitzvah of a Jewish female. So the first thing is, at the age of 13, the Jewish male will wear tefillin for the first time as a matter of law in fulfillment of the commandment to wear tefillin. What are the tefillin? Tefillin are 2 leather boxes, black boxes. One is put on the upper arm, and the other is on the head, above the forehead, between the eyes. And so the tefillin are generally worn, as a matter of law, they can be worn anytime during the day, not on the Sabbath and holidays, on weekdays. They can be worn any time during the day. They can be worn the whole day. But generally our practice is that we, just by way of custom, we wear them in the morning prayer service when praying. Okay? So at the age of 13, this is the first time when the Jewish male becomes bar mitzvah, subject to Jewish law, that the Jewish male then is putting on the tefillin as a matter of law and fulfillment of the command to wear tefillin. Now, for a Jewish female, there is no prohibition for a woman to put on tefillin, to wear tefillin. She's exempt from the law, the commandment. She's exempt. She's not required, but she's not prohibited. But as a matter of custom, in traditional Judaism, as a matter of custom, women did not put on tefillin. Parenthetically, we do know there was precedent for some women, there was precedent of some women putting on tefillin in the Middle Ages. For example, there's a widespread legend that the daughters of Rashi, the great biblical Talmudic commentator of the Jewish tradition, who lived in the 11th century, there's a widespread legend that his daughters wore tefillin. That as far as I'm aware, the legend has never been substantiated. However, even if it hasn't been substantiated, it's been widely accepted, even throughout the Orthodox world, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, a widespread legend that's been widely accepted that the daughters of Rashi put on tefillin. But aside from that legend, we do know there are other cases of women during the Middle Ages that have been substantiated, of women who did put on tefillin. However, those were exceptional cases. The general custom was that women did not put on tefillin, even though they're not prohibited, just by way of custom, that women are exempt from putting on the tefillin, but by way of custom, women did not traditionally put on the tefillin. So then at the bat mitzvah, there was no celebration in terms of the Jewish female putting on the tefillin for the first time, subject to Jewish laws in the case of the male. Okay. So that's one thing. Number two, the notion of aliyah. Now, aliyah literally means going up. Spiritually, it refers to a spiritual ascension, and it can, of course, mean aliyah, making aliyah for a Jew going to Israel to live who doesn't live in the land of Israel, or going to Israel to live is seen as aliyah, a spiritual ascension. Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people. But it's also used in another sense from a spiritual point of view, and that is in the synagogue, where in the synagogue, we as part of our prayers, we have a Torah reading. We read a portion of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. We read a portion of the Torah on the Sabbath holidays, and on the weekdays, on Mondays and Thursdays. Generally, it's in the morning prayer service. But on the Sabbath and holidays, it's a longer portion, okay, and on the weekdays, it's a shorter portion. And then in the synagogue, people are called up, and it's called an aliyah, and a spiritual ascension. People are called up to read from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the portion that's being read. So on the Sabbath, the portion is longer, it's 7 people are called up. On the weekdays, when the portion is shorter, it's 3 people, and the people divide up the portion to read. And each one is called up to read, and it's seen as an honor. And on the holidays, it's anywhere in between, 4 to 6. Okay, but it's seen as an honor. It's not a requirement. It's a mitzvah in the sense of a good deed, an honor, rather than an actual obligation or commandment. So in the case of bar mitzvah, the Jewish male would be called up to read as a part of the celebration of bar mitzvah, to have an honor of aliyah, of being called up to read from the Torah. And now here also, there's no prohibition for women to read from the Torah, to be called up and to have an honor and to read from the Torah. There is no prohibition in Jewish law. Here there's no requirement at all, even for Jewish males. Again, it's like an honor. So men are permitted to be called up, but women are also permitted to be called up and to read from the Torah. Women are permitted the same as men according to the ancient Talmudic law. However, already from the time of the Talmud, there was a custom that developed in the Jewish tradition that women are not called up to read from the Torah as a matter of custom. So again, in the bar mitzvah, that would be marked by the Jewish male being called up to read from the Torah as an honor in terms of celebrating the bar mitzvah. Bat mitzvah, women were not called up to read from the Torah. This was not the practice. It was as a matter of custom. Even though women are permitted, the custom was that women wouldn't be called up. So that was never in traditional Judaism a way of celebrating bat mitzvah. A third thing is a devar Torah, or divrei Torah. Literally means words of Torah, like a talk, a learned talk. Now, like a sermon, and that the bar mitzvah would give. Now, Talmud Torah literally means study of Torah. Talmud study, Torah. This is one of the central commandments of the Jewish tradition. Study, and the commandment of Talmud Torah is a commandment of study, of rigorous intellectual study of texts. And traditionally, the place that we fulfill the command is the Yeshiva Study Academy. The Beit Midrash is the study hall of the Yeshiva Study Academy. And even though you can study anywhere, that's the place where the commandment was a special place, devoted, sacred place, the Yeshiva, the Study Academy, a sacred place that's devoted to fulfilling the command of Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. The same as the synagogue is a sacred place for fulfilling the command of prayer, where, again, you can pray outside the synagogue anywhere, but it's a special place, a sacred place devoted to prayer. So Talmud Torah, then, the study of Torah was fulfilled by rigorous intellectual study, and again, generally by way of custom. Women were excluded from the yeshiva. The yeshiva was for Jewish males, and study is a commandment that, even though it's a commandment that's obligatory upon men, women are again exempt from such a commandment, like the tefillin. They're exempt. They're not prohibited from studying rigorous intellectual study of this nature, but they're exempt. And so the yeshiva was, again, by way of custom, a place for Jewish males to fulfill the command. So that, again, in giving a learned talk, Divrei Torah, that was done to honor the bar mitzvah. The Jewish male would give a learned talk, Divrei Torah, and generally a woman wouldn't do that in becoming bat mitzvah at the age of 12, the Jewish female. And then the last thing that was done to mark bar mitzvah was a blessing that the father would say in the synagogue, that the father would make a short blessing thanking God for having released him, for exempting him from punishment for the child. That the child is now, the Jewish male is now bar mitzvah, subject to Jewish law. The child is responsible for himself, for his own sin and wrongdoing. The father is now exempt from any punishment for the child. And that was a blessing that was said in the synagogue. So again, as far as I'm aware, no such blessing was said marking the bat mitzvah of a Jewish female. So it's in light of this that nothing was done to celebrate, as far as I'm aware in traditional Judaism, to celebrate bat mitzvah of a Jewish female, that I want to now address in the rest of this video and two other videos. I want to address the larger issue of the status of women in Judaism and Jewish law. So the question that I want to examine in these videos is whether there is discrimination to the detriment of women in Judaism. Now, the word discrimination, I want to begin by pointing out that the word discrimination in English is oftentimes has very negative connotations, but the word actually, from a dictionary point of view, is not negative or positive. Discrimination literally means to distinguish, to make a sharp distinction between things. It's actually a power, an ability that we have to discriminate between things, to discriminate, to distinguish. That's a power, ability that we have on the basis of our reason. It's a part of our rational judgment to make distinctions between things. So when we're dealing with treatment of people, and we make discrimination, we make distinctions in our treatment of people, there's a question that's a value judgment, question of subjective value judgment, whether that discrimination is beneficial or detrimental. So let's take a case not connected to Judaism, part of the larger Western culture. For example, it's widespread in the larger Western culture that we live in. There is discrimination in which disabled people receive preferential treatment, such as preferential parking spaces for their cars. Now, I think an overwhelming majority of people in the Western world would be in favor of such discrimination, would not see that as detrimental at all. That's to the benefit of disabled people, but not only to the benefit of disabled people, it's to the benefit of society as a whole. Part of living in a democratic society in the Western world is that in a democratic society, we want to take into consideration the needs or special needs of a minority population. And that's seen as beneficial to society as a whole. So discrimination is not necessarily something that's detrimental. It can be beneficial, it can be detrimental. That's a question of value judgment, very personal, subjective value judgment. Okay? So, but that's the question then that I want to raise, is whether there is discrimination in Judaism, in Jewish law, to the detriment of women. Okay, so in the continuation of this video, I'll examine a principle, a Talmudic legal principle, which reflects a very clear discrimination between men and women under Jewish law, a distinction in the way that men and women are treated under Jewish law. And the question is whether that discrimination reflected in this Talmudic principle, whether that discrimination is detrimental or whether it's detrimental to women. Okay, and what I'll argue to reveal my direction, I'll first examine the rationale for that principle, why, try to make sense of it, what it's about. I'll suggest one plausible explanation of what the principle is about. And in light of that, I'll suggest, in my opinion, according to my personal subjective value judgment, I don't think such a principle is detrimental to women. I don't think it's detrimental. But in the next two videos after that, I'll deal with, beyond this specific principle, the larger question of the status of women in Judaism and Jewish law, the status of women not just legally but socially. And then in those two videos, I will argue that in my view, personal view, I think there is very clearly discrimination to the detriment of women, and that women have very clearly within Jewish law an inferior status to that of men that constitutes, in my mind, discrimination to the detriment of women. That I'll argue in the next two videos. Okay, so let's look at this principle that goes back to the Talmud, okay, a Talmudic legal principle. And the principle is that it reflects, again, a discrimination between men and women, a distinction between men and women in Jewish law, that women are exempt from all positive time-bound commandments. So commandments can be positive and negative, positive requirements and negative prohibitions. So men and women are obligated in all prohibitions. Okay, there's no distinction whatsoever between men and women regarding prohibitions. Men and women are obligated in all of the prohibitions of the Jewish tradition in terms of commandments. Now, in terms of positive commandments, the woman is exempt from positive time-bound commandments. Time-bound meaning positive commandments, requirements that are done at a certain time. So I'll give several examples to make clear the principle. I'll give an example that fits the principle and a couple of examples that don't fit the principle, because this is a general principle with exceptions. So I'll give one example of a practice that fits the principle, and I'll give a couple of examples of things that don't fit the principle that are exceptional. But it is a general principle that women are exempt from positive time-bound commandments. So a case that fits the principle would be, I mentioned earlier, the wearing of tefillin, the leather boxes on the arm and on the head, that is generally done when we pray. This is a commandment that's of a positive nature. It's a requirement to put on the tefillin by law, a commandment. And it's done at a certain time. The tefillin are to be worn during the day and not at night, and not on the Sabbath or holidays, only during the weekdays, and during the day, not at night. Now they can be worn again anytime during the day, they can be worn the whole day, but generally the tefillin were worn and as a part of ritual practice. So in the Talmudic period, they were oftentimes worn the entire day, but while Talmudic rabbis and their students were in the yeshiva studying. Okay, today our practice is that we wear them only when praying. Generally in the synagogue or even at home they can be worn when praying, and we generally wear them only in the morning prayer service. So that the commandment is a positive time-bound commandment. Therefore, the woman, it fits the principle, a positive time-bound commandment. She's not prohibited from putting on tefillin, but she's exempt. She's not required. The man is required to wear the tefillin. Okay, so that's an example that fits the principle. Let me give two examples that don't fit the principle. So let me take another positive time-bound commandment, which we would expect for the woman to be exempt, and yet she's obligated the same as a man. So that would be the making of kiddush. Kiddush comes from the word kadosh, and in Hebrew that means holy, sacred. And kiddush is sanctification. We sanctify the Sabbath and holidays. Okay, and how do we do that? We do that by we sanctify over wine, and we do it in the evening meal in the home, the evening meal, and in the morning meal on the Sabbath and holidays. Now the holidays that we make kiddush are the holidays from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. There are 5 holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the 3 pilgrimage festivals. Ancient times, pilgrimage was made on these festivals to Jerusalem. Those are the 3 pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So obviously on Yom Kippur, which is a fast when we don't eat and don't drink, we don't make kiddush. But the other festivals, we make kiddush in the evening and in the morning, and we have a festive meal on the festivals, the same as in the Sabbath. We have a meal in the evening and the morning, and we make kiddush to sanctify the day over wine. We make a blessing over wine to sanctify the day. And so that's a positive time-bound commandment. It's a commandment that we do at a certain time on the Sabbath and festivals. And it's a positive time-bound commandment, so we would expect that the woman would be exempt, and yet she's obligated the same as the man. Another example of a positive non-time-bound commandment that we can do at any time, where we would expect the woman to be obligated the same as the man, and yet she's exempt. So that would be the mitzvah the commandment that I mentioned of Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, where we can study at any time. It's not time-bound, it's a requirement, but it's an exception here of the general principle. The woman should be obligated, yet she's exempt. The man is obligated in the commandment of Talmud Torah, the woman is exempt. So how to make sense of these exceptions and of the general rule? What's the rationale? What is this principle about? So I want to suggest what I think is the most plausible explanation, not original on my part, but I think is the most plausible explanation of this principle is that there's a Talmudic ideal. It's not a biblical ideal. It's not found as an ideal in the Bible. It's a Talmudic ideal that the place of a woman is in the home. And whether we identify with such an ideal or not, that's again a matter of subjective moral value judgment, whether we identify with such an ideal that the place of a woman is to be in the home. But I think we can understand such an ideal that generally, when we're talking about being in the home, we're talking about especially taking care of children, child rearing, and the woman in a natural way, I think from a biological point of view, has probably a stronger connection to the child coming out of her womb than a man does, and maybe even a stronger emotional connection in that light. But, so I think we can understand the ideal, even if we might not identify with it, for those who don't identify with such an ideal. But it is an ideal that the Talmud holds up, that the place of the woman is in the home. And that will explain the principle, the general principle, and the exceptions, okay, for the most part, as far as I'm aware. It will explain at least most of the exceptions, and it will explain the principle. Because positive time-bound commandments will take the woman away from the home, in general. Okay, so let's take the case of the wearing of tefillin. Again, you can wear tefillin anywhere, but the general place that they were worn was either in the yeshiva in the ancient Talmudic period, in studying, or today our practice is generally in the synagogue in the morning prayer service. So that if that's going to take her out of the home, and in general we put the tefillin on in the synagogue, then she's going to be exempt. Okay, because the ideal is that she should be in the home. So now in the case of kiddush, she's obligated the same as the man to make kiddush over the wine to sanctify the Sabbath and holidays, which is a positive time-bound commandment, and she's obligated, or we'd expect her to be exempt. Why is she obligated the same as the man? She doesn't have to leave the home. It's in the home that we make kiddush over the wine, sanctifying the Sabbath and holidays. So then the other exception, Talmud Torah. It's not a time-bound commandment. It's a positive commandment to study, rigorous intellectual study. It can be done any time. We would think the woman would be obligated the same as the man, and yet she's exempt. Why? Because the commandment was, again, it could be fulfilled anywhere, but the traditional place where we fulfill it is in the yeshiva, the study academy, the Beit Midrash, the study hall, the study academy. That would take the woman out of the home again. So now, that I think explains the principle in a general way. Now, I want to conclude by saying again that in my personal opinion, such a principle doesn't constitute discrimination to the detriment of women. And why do I say that? Because the woman is, according to this principle, isn't being prohibited from doing anything. She's only exempt, according to the principle. So in the case, again, the classic case of tefillin that fits the principle, she's not prohibited from putting on tefillin. It's only by way of custom that women have been excluded from wearing tefillin. That's a social issue. But in terms of the Jewish law, she's not prohibited from putting on tefillin, the woman. She's simply exempt, not required to put on the tefillin. So in terms of the Jewish law, leaving aside the social issue by way of custom that the woman's been excluded from wearing tefillin, by law, there's no discrimination here to the detriment of the woman because she is permitted to put on the tefillin if she so chooses. She's not prohibited. She's only exempt from fulfilling the law. And in terms of the ideal, the Talmudic ideal that the law apparently reflects, or this principle, the principle that a woman is exempt from positive time-bound commandments, the principle apparently reflects this Talmudic ideal that the place of the woman is in the home. So too, the woman is not required to be in the home. There's no, in my mind, discrimination here to the detriment of the woman because this is simply an ideal. In practice, if a woman wants to work outside the home, she's permitted to work outside the home, and then the couple, husband and wife, will have to make some kind of arrangement for taking care of children and taking care of the home, whether it's the husband who will stay in the home and the woman will work outside the home, or if both are working outside the home, a caretaker in the home or some other arrangement, that they'll find some arrangement, but the woman is not required to be in the home. This is simply an ideal. So that even if somebody doesn't identify with such a Talmudic ideal, again, of the place of the woman is in the home, in any case, this isn't a requirement. So I don't think you can argue here that there's discrimination to the detriment of women in the case of the Talmudic ideal and in the case of the principle itself that the woman is exempt from positive time-bound commandments. So in the next two videos, I then will argue that in terms of the status of women in Judaism and Jewish law, legal status, social status, I do think that there is very clearly discrimination to the detriment of women. And that will be in the next two videos. Thank you.